of God as a genocidal monster. That's what we talked about last time. And if you remember, we kind of went through some trigger warnings, so all those are still in effect. Not going to try to get too graphic or violent. And we concluded kind of talking about a couple things. We kind of touched a little bit on free will and predestination, which we're going to get a little bit more into today and see that neither one actually has an effect on the question of, is God a moral monster or is God a genocidal monster? Neither one of those doctrines has an effect. And we're also going to look at, like where Gerd Ludemann, a famous Christian theologian turned atheist, he had this problem that God couldn't stay true to his own laws and thought God was a hypocrite. We're going to look at that challenge to see, is God a hypocrite? And we're going to look at these and see if these are true and look at why did God flood the world? We talked last time, God doesn't do anything about sin. Well, he killed the whole world with the flood. Well, I want him to do something else about sin. Oh, you want to continue sinning? We see that contradiction in people's thought. Well, I just don't like how God handles sin. That's what they're saying, because last time when we read Genesis chapter 6, we saw that the whole world, there was no exception. Everyone was corrupt. And that actually included Noah, if you read the description. There was a change in Noah, which we'll talk about. And then, of course, we see that God ordered the genocide of certain tribes in Canaan. Lane brought up that there are other theories out there about spiritual warfare is dealing with the Nephilim. If we take the supernatural angels coming into the humans, we're not going to go down that line in this class. And we're going to go into starting off about 2,400 years ago. So this is before Jesus, and Plato's teacher was a man named Socrates. And this is a dilemma that today still reverberates and people have trouble with. And I want you to chew on this. And it's not easy because either answer is wrong. That's why it's a dilemma. Now, there was a theologian of the day named Euphorio. And he was going to court because he was going to charge his dad with murder. That's not something you did 2,400 years ago. If your dad did murder, you didn't charge him with murder. You were loyal to your family. And Socrates, there was a man with a, quote, ill beard. So even 2,400 years ago, you're supposed to have an awesome beard. It's in the history books. Was charging Socrates with being an atheist. And so Socrates, using the Socratic method, asking questions, starts to ask Euphorio. He's like, that's kind of not moral. That's not morally good to charge your dad with murder. And Euphorio says, well, there's different levels of good. My dad, I have to be true to the gods. Remember, the Greeks had a pantheon of gods. They were polytheists, many gods. He goes, I have to respect the gods' good above our good. And, my dad being a murderer is worse than family loyalty. So I'm following the gods. And Socrates says, but even the gods don't agree. So how do you know which good from the gods you have to follow? And Euphorio, being a theologian, goes, what all the gods agree on is good. He actually uses the word piety. And so Socrates thinks on this and goes, okay, I can agree with that. He goes, let me ask you, is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it's good? Now, of course, philosophers have changed this to monotheism. And so the same question is asked of our God. Does our God command something because it's good, or is it good because God commands it? Think about this. Now, depending on your doctrines, we've all heard, especially some of these very strong people, God is sovereign, right? He is ultimately sovereign. His sovereignty can't be more sovereign. Personally, I like the term maximally great. But here's a problem with this. Let's say something is good because God commands it. Okay, the flood is good because God commands it. All right, good. The 10 Commandments are good because God commands it. All right, good. Let's look at predestination, right? And don't worry, I'm going to attack free will too, so don't get too upset at me just yet. I'm going to show you why everything fails. And so in predestination, God commands certain people will go to heaven. And God if he's commanding certain people to go to heaven, by default, since God is sovereign, certain people will go to hell. And if we just follow this through to its logical end, when God kills them, whether they've made a choice or not, they're going to their ultimate destination. So it doesn't matter that God killed them, because he had already commanded, and it's good, whatever God commands, that they're going to go to heaven or hell. In fact, there's really no reason for people to even live, because God's already commanded it. So actually, if we follow this through, every person should actually kill themselves, and I'm not advocating suicide, because God's already commanded it. So even if you're not saved and God's commanded that you're going to heaven, you're still going to go to heaven, so Christ didn't need to die on the cross. Do you see how absurd this starts to get, right? Because something's good that God commanded it. Do you see why this argument starts to fail? Okay. Now, even worse than that, does anybody here, you guys have seen some of my other classes, I think I talked about kicking babies, right? How many people think it's morally good to kick a baby? No one. We've already agreed on this as a group of people. Now, what if God commanded that it's good to kick that's morally good to kick a baby? Uh-oh. Because we just said things are good, morally good because God commands it. And if God is ultimately sovereign, he can command anything to be morally good. He can command murder to be morally good. He can command kicking babies to be morally good. Tomorrow we can wake up and God can go, I changed my mind, it's opposite Thursday. We're doing the opposite of the 10 commands to be morally good. The arbitrariness of this dilemma comes into effect. That's the first problem. Things are morally good because God commands them. All right, now for all you that believe in free will, my turn to come after you. Told you, nobody's getting away scot-free on this dilemma. All right, back to Genesis. Everyone was evil, to include Noah. Somehow, Noah, through free will, chose to, through faith, which is what we're taught, in Romans. Paul says that Abraham by faith. It's free will, right? So things are morally, God commands things because they are morally good. Well, we have an issue with this, too, because now God's not sovereign. He's not maximally great. There's a moral goodness outside of God, right? God commands things because they are morally good. So God is following whatever this moral goodness is. Well, now I no longer want to worship God. I want to worship this moral goodness because God has to answer to moral goodness. That's part of this dilemma that Socrates has created. And, there's this moral goodness that exists outside of God, and God is now beholden to a moral goodness. Now, this doesn't make sense because I'm going to put this in terms of numbers. Before anything existed, we know that there was the Trinity of God. So numbers existed. But does God answer to numbers? No, because God is the creator of everything, but numbers didn't exist, but yet there was three persons in one Trinity. So somehow numbers had to exist before numbers existed. We'll come back to that thought. I know that hurts people's brains to think about. But the problem with the free will side on this is let me try to get my thoughts straight on why this part of the dilemma is going to fail, is things are morally good because God commands them, and we all understand why that's arbitrary and that can fail, right? Any questions on that? Did I go too fast? Okay. And then God commands things because they're morally good. So there's something outside of God. God's no longer sovereign, and God has to answer to whatever this moral goodness is. Now, if people can be, freely choose their own moral goodness, and God's not completely sovereign, we kind of end up in this whole chaotic universe of like, what's really going on? What is the point? Can we even trust God at this point? So in this case, we still have this failing justice, like this failing dilemma where we have a weak God that doesn't exist. And that's why skeptics love this dilemma. It's called Euphoros' dilemma. Because no matter which option we take, God fails. And that's why they love to throw it as. And so when we're looking at God giving this command, hey, I'm going to command the earth to flood. I'm going to command Abraham to kill his son Isaac. And notice, Abraham follows through. And what does it take? It takes God interfering to stop Abraham, right? When it comes to the whole world, we see that they are so corrupt that they're unwilling to change their mind. And it takes God having to come into the earth and interfere. And he has one man that's willing to change. Of course, God knows, because he's sovereign, how this is going to play out. Isaiah says, I declared the end from the beginning. And so he destroys everybody. And of course, he knows whether they would have changed by faith or not. And then when we come into the land of Canaan, we're going to look at this a little bit more in depth about why is God making these commands. And we're going to come back to Euphoros' dilemma about, does God command something because it's good, or is it good because God commands it? Now, so let's first answer the questions about kill versus murder, because I've heard these topics before. Well, to kill is okay, but to murder is a sin. Has anybody ever heard that before? No? Yeah? To kill is okay, but to murder is a sin. Has anybody ever heard that before? People have said that, especially for soldiers. Hey, you had to kill in war. That's not a sin. But, if I just went and, started strangling Ken because he likes the Longhorns, that's murder, right? Like, that would be a sin. Right? Well, they're the Longhorns, so, most judges would be, like, iffy on it. But, yeah, but you get my point. The thing is this argument actually comes from a translation in the King James, because most Bibles nowadays says in Exodus 20, thou shalt not murder, or you shouldn't murder, depending on the translation. King James says, thou shalt not kill. And this has caused a lot of confusion for people. Really, the word is ratash in Hebrew, which means like to kill with intention, right? So it doesn't matter if we're saying kill or murder. It says don't do it with intention. And why do I bring this up? Because God clearly does not kill by accident. Look at the flood. That was not an accident. He killed with intention. But ratash has more meaning to it than just that. And so when we look at Exodus 22 through 3, it says, if a thief is caught in the act of breaking in and he's beaten to death, no one is guilty of bloodshed. But if this happens after sunrise, the householder is guilty of bloodshed. The thief must make full restitution. If he is unable, he is to be sold because he is a thief. So this was a literal law to the Hebrews, and I'm not advocating for slavery or beating thieves to death. But we want to apply this in a modern sense, and we want to take application of how does this apply to a holy God. And what he's saying is, in the act of sin, punishment is necessary. Once the sin's over, retaliatory punishment shouldn't be excessive. Does that make sense? There should always be justice, but it shouldn't be excessive. It should be proportional to the crime. And a lot of laws have been based on this. Now, so when we apply, and remember, Gerd Ludemann, I told you, he has this problem of a hypocritical God that can't meet his own law. But when we look at the law of God, does God meet his own law? When he sends the flood, well, he sees the thief breaking in. He declares that the wickedness of everyone, that's in Genesis. He's talking about everybody in their present sense. They are the thieves currently breaking in. He's not guilty of bloodshed in Genesis 6 when he sends the flood. They are currently the thieves breaking in. So I want to let you know, yeah, he did kill them, but did he violate his law, as Gerd Ludemann, Christian turned atheist theologian, says? No, he's not a hypocrite. He's actually following his own law in this case. When we get to the commands in Deuteronomy 20:16 through 17, where he talks about, but of these cities, of these people, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, And I'm going to come back to this inheritance land. You shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, just as the Lord God has commanded you. So this is where that genocide comes against God, right? Because he's saying just utterly destroy everything. Now, you'll see later down in your notes, Paul Copan, he makes the case that this is hyperbole, right? Like this is how they wrote back then. And the case for this is the Mesnef Stele, which I have later down in the notes. It's this big monument that the Egyptians carved out. It's a very Old Testament, or like thousands of years old, before King David. And we see that they talk about a battle with Israel. They say that they utterly destroyed everything that lived when they fought Israel. We know that that's not true because Israel still was around. But that's how ancient kingdoms talked about battles. You remember how history is written by the winner? No winners are going to say like, hey, I just barely won this war. Especially look at the Egyptian carvings. They're not going to go to that kind of length of carving out these big things to say, I barely won. They're going to make their king sound awesome. Oh, we obliterated everything. And it's that kind of hyperbole. And Paul Copan, as a theologian, is making that case for this Deuteronomy example. We're going to destroy everything. Now, of course, the Christian inerrantist is going to be like, well, wait a minute. Is this hyperbole? Is this not? And we're going to look at that a little bit more. But that could have been a way of speaking at the time. But that's the command of God. And even if this is hyperbole, it's still God giving the command. So is God just to give this command? We're back to our question. Is something good because God commands it? Or, you see what I mean with Euphoros' dilemma? It doesn't matter what the Israelites did. God still gave this command, even if it's hyperbole. So we still have to answer this moral question about God. So Paul Copan, trying to defend God right now, he doesn't do the best case by saying this could be hyperbole. It could be, but I think we still need a little bit more in there to fully understand where God's coming from. And so let's talk about the timing coming behind this. So, and remember this law, because they have to be full in their sin for the killing to be just, right? And so in Abraham's day, the time wasn't right for judgment on the Canaanites, or the land to vomit them out. And that's in Leviticus 18:25, because even though God does say, kill everything, which I think is a little bit of a hyperbole, maybe not as much as Paul Copan says, but we do have recordings in Leviticus where it does say, let the land vomit them out. There's also times where you see them driving people out, but they don't chase them. They don't go and slaughter them when they run away. The whole point was God wanted the land cleared, didn't want them chased and destroyed. So we don't see a contradiction in Scripture. We see that God's ultimate plan was to clear the land. And he doesn't actually go after every single city either. There's like 7 cities that he wants destroyed, which we're going to talk about Paul Hess's exegesis of the passages a little bit later. But he looks at those as more as military outposts that would have been cleared of the women and children, which is kind of what we see today with Gaza, right? Like, hey, kill everybody that's there, but it should only be men. If somebody decided to stay there, they probably shouldn't be there. And that's probably more what was really happening, was the battles were between men, all the women, cattle, and all that stuff was already evacuated. And God's like, look, if they stayed, they shouldn't have been there. And that makes more sense of Deuteronomy 20:16 through 17, where God's like, utterly destroy anything that's there. Because most likely, all the women, children, and livestock would have left these towns before the wars happened. And Matthew has, or I think it's Matt, but yeah, he makes a very good case about that. It's in the notes, and we'll talk about that. But God has also, in his mercy, given these people a lot of time. And you'll see that God's always showing mercy, because everybody's like, he's a genocidal maniac. But, when Isaac went to kill Abraham, God stops him. There was no killing. When it comes to the flood, even though everyone was wicked, and the Bible's clear, everyone, all, remember how I enunciated those words? That would have included Noah, but yet God knew that Noah and his family had the ability to turn, and so he put them on an ark and he saved them. There was mercy where none should have been, and we call that grace. So that's not consistent with a genocidal monster. And when we see this land of Canaan invasion, first off, the iniquity of the Amorites is not full. That was declared back in Genesis, 420 years before the conquest of Canaan. God had enslaved his own people in Egypt, mostly for their own protection so that they wouldn't become corrupt. But during these 400 plus years, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, all of them, they had a chance to, through natural revelation and all this stuff, to stop being an abomination, stop throwing their children into fires, to stop their idol worship, to stop all this stuff. They made the choice to go ahead and continue down these paths of no return. So now it could have been a spiritual battle, just like Lane said, with the Nephilim. That's not ruled out, but at the end of the day, the people there had become such an abomination that God was like, I have given you 400 years to turn from this, and just like the flood, there's no turning back for you at this point. I know your future. You will not turn back, and as my people come in, you're going to infect them, and they're going to turn to your evil ways, and I don't want more people burning babies. So you're to be thrown out of this land. That was his ultimate goal, was to drive everybody out of the land, which Leviticus is very clear on. So this is what happens when you don't read the entire Bible. The people that make the claim that God is a genocidal monster because he said, I want you to utterly destroy the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Yeah, that's absolutely in Deuteronomy. I just read it. But you got to read Leviticus. You got to read Numbers. You got to read all of this up into Joshua to understand what's really going on with the conquest. And then you'll see that the ultimate goal of the conquest was actually to drive people out. If they chose to stay, then they're to be destroyed. See this if-then relationship that God was given? Even in the destruction of war, there was still always a choice. Now, for the truly evil ones that were burning babies to Moloch, yeah, they're going to be destroyed. Their fate was sealed. They had 400 years to change, and they did it. Now, there's also other examples of God's mercy. Sodom and Gomorrah. That's a very good example of Jewish bargaining, right? And I'm not being anti-Semitic or anything, but you see Abraham, the father of all the Israelites, going, okay, you're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. What if you find 50 righteous men? God's like, okay, I'll save the city. And Abraham's like, oh, I don't think there's that many. What about 40? Okay, I'll save the city. All the way down to 10, right? And God's willing to spare in 2 entire cities for 10 righteous men. Bear in mind, there's already 2 angels in the city in human form. So you only have to find 8 more. Couldn't do it, right? God was willing to show mercy. And even then, he still allowed Lot and his wife and 2 daughters to escape the city of destruction. God always has mercy. People fail to see God's mercy when he's executing judgment, and they forget that he is a judge who has perfect wrath. Let's hold on to that word perfect, because we're going to come back to Euphrates dilemma in a minute. Now, was it really genocide that God had the Israelites do? Because in the conquest of Canaan, we read about a lot of battles, right? Joshua 7, Numbers. And like I said, we've got to read all of these. And there's times that they're like, you know what? We're going to go to battle without God. Or we're going to bring the ark without divine command. And what happens? They get whooped like the Longhorns going against the Crimson Tide. This year. I wanted to see what he'd say. We won that game. Well, I just had to say that because I saw Brian here. I just wanted to see the little... But no, they got their butts handed to them. Why? Because God's not about just absolute bloodshed and genocide. He's about perfect divine judgment. And God didn't command those battles. And so when the Israelites were feeling all proud of themselves, like, yeah, we bad? We going to do this? God's like, no, you're not. And he handed the victory to the other people because that wasn't his plan. And again, we have to read the full Bible to get a full account. So when people are like, oh, God's a genocidal monster. Yeah? Oh, because of one verse? Did you read all 5 books of the Torah? Did you read Joshua that includes the actual conquest of Canaan? Did you see where the Israelites lost when they didn't have God's favor? How's God a genocidal monster? Did God break his own holy rules? Because God says, if you're in sin, then you deserve to die. But if you're outside of sin, you don't deserve to die. God never broke his own commandments, any of the 613. So we're starting to see that all these accusations going against God, they start to fail as we really start to examine them. Now, I think we've kind of talked about why God would do this, the idol worship, the sacrifice of children, and of course, another reason was Israel. If you go back to like the Table of Nations in Deuteronomy chapter 32, Israel as a land was actually set apart as God's own land. He gave the rest of the world away, and you can read this in Deuteronomy 32, just like the prince of Persia, in the book of Daniel, was a spiritual entity. Israel itself, God said, is my land. So when God says, I'm giving this land to the Israelites, that's God's own personal piece of land recorded about in Deuteronomy 32. So when you have these other people sitting on his land, because people are like, well, these Canaanites had a right to be there. No, they're thieves sitting on God's land. He wanted them driven out. And this is very well recorded from the Genesis 10 and 11, the genealogies and the Tower of Babel when everybody starts to go out, as well as Deuteronomy 32, the apportionment of lands. You will see that God sets apart the land of Israel as his own land. So again, him driving people out of his land, cleaning his house, he's not violating any laws. Now, Richard Hess, not Matthew Hess, sorry. All the battles were military outposts and soldiers. Women would not have been present. So yeah, there is a little hyperbole when God's like, destroy them. But if the women, the animals were present, sure, absolutely. They were to be destroyed, but chances are they were not present. So it's a both and kind of answer there. Does everybody kind of understand that?
Didn't he tell them to wipe out those 7 people groups, not just 7 cities?
Yeah, well, the cities would have been based around the people groups, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And then Leviticus 18:25, that's the command to drive out, but there's no command to follow and kill them. Only those that choose to remain behind will be utterly destroyed because they're the thieves trying to steal God's land. So again, there's a lot more going into this than just idol worship and stuff. There's this whole setting up of God's land. And of course, we know why God needs this land because 1,500 years later, the Messiah is going to be born and he needs to die on that land, right? And that's because everybody will be given an eternal life through him. There's a bigger plan going on here. Now, I do want to kind of follow up, and we're getting real close to time, that there's one other thing, is God is all powerful. He could stop everybody from dying, even today. But nobody wants to accuse him of being a genocidal monster today, because even though every single person experiences death. Do we notice the hypocrisy in that charge? The Old Testament God is a genocidal monster for the flood and the Canaanites. But yet today, all humans die. Every person dies in his own time. That's in Hebrews 9:27, Genesis 3:19. God had a cherubim cover up the tree of life. Nobody gets mad at God for natural death, but they seek to find reasons to point fingers at him. And as we actually start to analyze the text and all this stuff, we see that these reasons don't hold up. But like I said, the Messiah had to die in Jerusalem to give everybody life because Jesus holds the keys of life. That's Revelation 1:18. Does the fact that everyone experiences physical death make God a killer? No, because he gives everyone the chance for for spiritual life, for eternity, right? So, He's no murderer. Now, let's go back to Euphoros' dilemma. I want to give you the answer to that one real quick. So, part of the problem people fail to realize is we're comparing two bad categories. We start off with a pantheon of gods who can disagree, but we only take the things that they agree on. Well, if they can disagree before, they can disagree on the things they agree on. That can change. Our God, remember I said hold on to that word perfect? Our God's a perfect God, which means anything he comes up with will always be perfect. Do you remember how I asked you if he could change his mind tomorrow and say it's opposite Thursday on the Ten Commandments? What some people have a hard time understanding is God, and say with me as I say this, God can't do that. There are certain things God can't do because he's perfect. To do anything less than perfect, he wouldn't be God. So for him to change the Ten Commandments wouldn't be perfect, and he wouldn't be God. Does that make sense? So, when we ask, is something good because God commands it? Kind of. Does God command something because it's good? Kind of. It's actually kind of both. Something is good because God is good. His nature is good. God is perfect. And that's what people have failed to understand with Euphoros' dilemma. They were taking a pantheon of gods who could disagree with each other, who were not perfect, and then they try to equate that to a monotheistic God. And even then, there's a few different monotheistic gods, but ours, according to our Bible and who we know, is a perfect God. And once you look at the perfect God, you realize Euphoros' dilemma starts to fall apart because they're only giving us two choices. Is something good because God commands it? Well, God's commanding it because he is good. His nature is good, and his nature will never change, right? So when God's commanding the destruction or the utter destruction of the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, all them, it's because he's good. Now, think of this. Everybody here, I assume, has been a parent at one point or another, or plans to be, or has been, at least been a child. Going to the dentist is no fun. Everybody hates the dentist. But the parents command you to go to the dentist. Why? Because it's good. It hurts like the dickens, but it's good for you, right? It doesn't feel good as a kid. You hate it. You don't want to go there. You don't want to hear that. It's horrible. But your parents command it because it's good. As a kid, you think it's bad. Do you see the difference here? God commands it because he's a parent that is good. He knows what's good for us, even though we argue and kick and scream and think it's bad. You killed all those people. That's bad. Well, that's like us being the kid in the dentist chair. God, being the parent, knows what's good for us. He knows that if he hadn't driven them out, that land wouldn't have become Israel's. Jesus wouldn't have died in Golgotha. We wouldn't have been able to come through, get to heaven by grace through faith, right? It's the same kind of concept. We're looking at God as little children in the dentist chair. And people don't realize that when they make that accusation, is God a genocidal monster? That's like the kid going, my parents are big meanies for making me go to the dentist. That's the best way of looking at this problem. Hopefully that makes sense, the way I tried to sum it up in the end. I will take any questions you have, and then after that, we'll get into prayers. And
Trying to think through that too, getting back to him commanding them to wipe them out one way or another, either if they stay there, if you're gone, get out, whatever. Since God is good, his decision is good, and it's good for humanity, and undoubtedly it was good for the world for them to be wiped out.
yeah,
Now again, we don't understand it because we're sitting in the dentist chair. But in God's view, that's the best thing to happen. Does that make sense? Am I right on that? Who's in God's view is outside of time and space. He can see what they're going to be. Yeah.
but the children, after 400 years of indoctrination, would have grown up to come after and kill more children, to idol worship. Yep. So that's what I have on this one. It was kind of a two-parter. Again, any questions, I'm happy to answer them. We can look forward to our next problem of, I've been kind of leaning towards abortion, if you guys want to look into that one. I'm pro-life myself, but you see how I approach stuff. So I try to present both sides fairly and look at why I'm right.
I think that it is always helpful to have ways to express our views that really make a point to people whose views differ from ours. Because, I mean, I can say until the cows come home that every life is precious from conception to death, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to agree with me. So,
Yeah.
so I think that the more that we can know, the better. And I feel like I'm benefiting from this. I do.
Oh, good. Yeah, and like I said, if anybody else would like to look at a different problem of, feel free to put them forward. I'm happy to address any of them. There's also, there's plenty of them. The problem of divine hiddenness, something that you may have been struggling with, somebody may have brought up to you. Feel free to throw them out. If not, I'll pick out my own. Like I said, if I don't hear anything, I'll probably do abortion.